Do you want to know why and how relationships at work matter? If you do, join me now with my next guest, Russel Lolacher, and we will find out about relationships at work.
Hi folks, welcome to the Moving Beyond Being Good podcast by Gary Ryan from Organisations That Matter. In this podcast, Gary shares everything about servant leadership, service leadership, authentic leadership, how to create high performance cultures, service excellence, and life balance. Here's your host, Gary Ryan.
Thank you, Sienna, for your lovely introduction. I really appreciate your work. I'm here with Russel Lolacher, and we're going to be talking about relationships at work. Now, why do they even matter? Before we go there, though, Russell is the host of the Relationships at Work podcast. We'll have the links in the show notes for you. We'll talk all about that as we go through this. But Russell, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Gary. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, you better mention to people where you're coming in from, where you're flying in from through all those digital things in the world that we can have this chat right now.
I am in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, a beautiful part of the world. Just an island just west of Vancouver.
Yes. Some TV shows take place not far from where you are, around some pretty wild animals and people trying to survive and stuff, if I understand correctly.
I've heard of this. I've heard of this show. I've heard of people being abandoned and having to find their way out, but thankfully I've not run into any of them.
Yeah, that's right, because they're alone. I think that's the name of that show.
Yes,
that's right.
And afraid.
Yes, and discover how important. Well, I haven't watched a lot of that, but I have watched a couple of series. Mm-hmm. But interestingly, I guess on the topic of relationships, nearly to a person, they discover how important relationships are to them because they actually are alone for that entire period on that show. They just got that camera, and how the camera nearly takes on a personality like Wilson in the movie, right?
That's a good comparison.
That's right. Which leads us to what sparked your interest in delving into understanding relationships at work, Russell?
Oh, absolutely. So I was very much, my origin story is I was very much into so I'll start with the why, right? The why of everything I had done was all around basically treating people better, just being kinder in our interactions for no other reason than to build a stronger connection. And I found myself in the customer service, customer experience realm. And I was getting some pretty good notoriety in that. I was doing some pretty nice international speaking gigs and getting on a lot of top this and top that lists. And then I found myself at a conference in San Francisco. I was doing a panel there. And just for funsies, I decided to ask around and go, hey, so what about employees? Gary, the glazed looks that I saw from attendees, speakers, it was just customer equaled money. And at that time, this is 2018, employees were just this other thing that they had to do. It was not the priority, not certainly the conversation we're having now, but it was eye-opening. So I quickly pivoted because, again, my why is about treating people better, connections. I'm not about the customer, but I am about humans. So employees, I've been in leadership and communications for so long, this just felt like such a natural move and direction. And nobody was talking about it. I even Googled at the time going, how many books were being written about customers versus employees? I think it was 1 to 100 at that point. I think the ratios are starting to get better, but it was brutal.
Yeah. So Herb Kelleher, is that a name that sounds familiar to you?
It does. Absolutely.
Yeah. So he was the founder of Southwest Airlines.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, in his 3 books, he always spoke about the first customer were the employees. And he talks about love. He actually uses, or he did, he's not alive anymore, but he used the word love in relation to how the culture would be and how his relationship and the relationship between the employees needed to be. Because if they didn't do that, they couldn't possibly really love the customer. Now, Southwest Airlines is one of the greatest success stories in the airline industries globally from an economic, commercial point of view in terms of even in the year 2001, they were one of 3 airlines globally that made a profit that year. Every other airline didn't when there was the Twin Towers disaster and everything that came with that. So, there is some, but as you say, 1 in 100 talking about that. So you've got that confronting scenario where people aren't even interested in the employees. Where did you go from there?
Well, it was very much so. My background's in radio broadcasting, my background's in leadership, so it just felt like a natural transition into sort of putting my hub together around relationships at work, because we talk about things like trust, leadership, community, all these buzzwords, and I hate to use the word buzzwords, but they kind of are if we're not defining them. And nobody seems to do that in the corporate world, which is define the terms that we use on our posters, our emails. They're thrown around so willy-nilly that I'm like, you know what? Let's set up a baseline, because, and I'm sure you've read this, is that there's so many leaders that are set up to fail because they start in their early 30s or mid 30s in their first leadership role and then never get any training until they're in their mid 40s. So they're having to find their way, cobble together whatever modelship or modeling that they can see of what good leadership looks like. So I thought, you know what, why not put some resources together from experts? Gary, you've been on my show, that really understand what this takes to really understand human trust, servant leadership, and to get it as many angles as possible. So that's really where I pivoted in, was in to create the show, the newsletter, the website, and so forth, that really just starts creating resources that people can rely and refer to.
Yeah. So what would some of those resources be, Russell, that you've created?
No, absolutely. So the podcast is obviously the hub of all things. And I've been really fortunate to have some amazing people on. And the focus has been everything from mental health, very many aspects of mental health, diversity, equity, inclusivity, belonging, theater, connection, how it builds culture. At the end of the day, the baseline for all my episodes is really helping leaders understand their impact on the work culture, for good and for bad. I think leaders are so focused on understanding delivering a thing or fixing a problem for somebody else that they don't understand that the actions and inactions that they take have lasting years, decades of impacts on people. The first question I ask on every episode is, what's your best or worst employee experience? As you remember, Gary.
Yes.
And amazingly, it's okay. Most of the time it's a negative one because that's what we remember, but it's also from like 20, 30 years ago. And it's one leader from when they were 18 that treated them like crap, and they carry it for decades. Yes. And I bet you that leader they had back then doesn't remember their name, probably didn't even think about when they were being a jerk. But look at the trauma that they've caused that has ripple effects to that person for the rest of their career. So I don't think as leaders we get it. And I really want to hammer that home, is that we really impact people for good and for bad. And the more we embrace and understand that, I think we'll have a better impact on our work cultures.
And along those lines, when you've got employers who have a young workforce, so a lot of the fast food restaurants, for example, where a lot of our children go for their first jobs, okay? I can tell you as a fact that in out of my 5 children, the eldest 3, who all worked for a fast food store that might look like something like that, but people who are listening can't see what I'm drawing, but anyone else who's watching can. So go to YouTube and watch this episode if you want to know who I'm talking about. They all had a leader, a manager, tell them that, yell at them and tell them that they were stupid. In 3 completely separate scenarios, all 3 had that happen in the first 3 weeks. So these are young teenagers, 15 years of age here in Australia, and the leaders themselves are 19, 20, 22 maybe, treating them like that. So somehow those young leaders, those young managers learned that was okay, right? And in each of my 3 children's situations, as you're saying, it's like, well, I know I'm just a number. And I in the professional work that I do, I'm like, that organization actually doesn't have a right to have my children come home from just doing a shift already saying I'm just a number. Right. And this comes from this lack of real understanding of what leadership is, and the lack of training, as you highlighted as well. I mean, it's absolutely deplorable that people are just under, on average, 47 years of age before they get formal training. But there is another aspect to that I am interested in on that point is, from your perspective, what have you discovered about why are people going into leadership roles, not getting trained by the company, but then accepting that there's no training and not taking action to get trained anyway. Have you come across anything around that perspective? Like, what's stopping them from learning how to lead anyway when they know they're going into a leadership role, even if the company doesn't pay for it?
Well, that's absolutely. There's two questions there. Is the why would they go into that role, and why would they take on that extra learning? So two things. For the first one, most people, of course, will take more responsibility because it comes with a bigger paycheck. And when you first start in those roles, as you said, the difference between that 22-year-old manager and that 16-year-old kid is probably like $5 an hour. But that's a lot of money for somebody at that age. And they're like, oh, I just have to close up a couple nights a week. Not understanding that you're basically modeling the window of what the workforce looks like for a 15, 16-year-old and having that trauma for them. So most of it is just, it's something I actually should do because that's what you're supposed to do in work. Is move up the corporate ladder, regardless of where the rung is in that ladder. It's money. Yeah. It's money. Opportunity, I think, would be another thing, is learning, is to get exposed to other things. A lot of motivations, but at that young age, probably paycheck. However, what you do beyond that, well, that's a whole other thing. It's an understanding of why you need to take that learning and leadership, because both the organization and yourself have a responsibility. The organization's not off the hook, but also us as individuals are absolutely not off the hook.
Yes.
If you have an organization that does not provide proper training, or training that just isn't adequate enough, how many books are out there? How many courses are out there? How many podcasts like yours and mine are out there? There is an abundance. It's almost a little too noisy of how much, but you don't have no excuses that there isn't great content out there to make and help you become a better leader. First off, I think we need to define leadership. And I want to go back to that point as well, because there's a difference. And I've talked about this in my newsletter. There's a difference between impact and success. So in an organization, to be successful and to be impactful can be two very different things. I've had people go straight out of university and go, if I do these three things, I know it will have the most impact for our customers. But my boss tells me to do something completely different. And I'm like, so what do you want to be, successful or impactful? Well, I want to be successful. Okay, then do what your boss told you.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if it's a failure, but he or she wants you to do that thing. And if you do it like they want, then you move up the ladder. But that's leadership as it's defined in that organization, is do what I tell you, deliver a widget, fix a thing. So when you're looking at your professional development, you need to define for yourself what success is. If leadership is defined as this in the organization, you need to take project management courses, not leadership courses. You need to take courses that align with what your organization defines as success. However, if they're the Brene Brown types, which is leaders create other leaders, then that's a whole other stream of professional development. But I think for you, you have to be motivated. You have to want to move up the ladder. And to do that, you have to figure out what you're trying to achieve and then reverse engineer the learning to get to that point. But I think a lot of us I remember going into a master's conversation with a university back in the day. They're like, why do you want to take a master's? I didn't have an answer. He goes, 80% of the people in my class in my master's program have no idea why they're here. But they're spending the money. I'm like, that's great. But what are we doing here? So to answer your question, I think absolutely it's our responsibility if we want to be better leaders, but we have to define what success is for ourselves and for the organization and try to figure out what that alignment is along our leadership journey. And
also with that defining, because you also said define success and define leadership. And you also said along the lines of it's so messy out there, so much information out there that has become challenging. And you're 100% right, because if someone wanted to do it right now, listening or watching us, Russell, if they just did a Google search on the word leadership, they'll end up with about 1.4 billion hits. Okay. And I would argue that as a result of there being so much information about leadership, it's actually become confusing. So the most important thing to do at an individual level is define leadership for yourself. Come up with your own, which means you got to read, you got to listen to some podcasts, spend a bit of time doing some research and go, you know what? I like that form of leadership. I like the idea of servant leadership, but then make it your own. Get clarity about, well, what does that mean? So that even if you are in a scenario where success is defined as sort of delivering on project management goals or whatever it might be, you can still bring your authentic leadership, if you end up in a leadership role, to that. Okay. Then if you do go and do some form of leadership training, you are far more informed and in a far better position to continue to clarify and shape your definition of leadership. And I would really strongly encourage anyone, if any of you have direct reports, people that are reporting to you in your organization in any shape or form, and you haven't got clarity around what you believe leadership is, then you've got an immediate responsibility to start working on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, there's a few pieces to that. I totally agree. So there is a few things to that. I think a lot of people need to understand when they define their leadership style, leadership definition, but go into an organization that defines it completely differently, you may not be a culture fit. You may not want to even stay in that organization because you're going to just keep hitting your head against the wall, expecting things to happen that won't, expecting things to be addressed that won't. And that might be hard on you from a mental health perspective as well. So it's really understanding what your own definition is, but also what you're willing to put up with and sacrifice within that bubble of what you define leadership to be. Having said that, as a leader, and we both know this, you can only control what you can control. So you could be in an organization that is very widget productivity focused, or it could be a deeply toxic culture as well that says these things and doesn't do them. But you have a team as a leader that you're responsible for, and you are responsible for protecting them, for modeling what behavior is and should be. Because truthfully, you can go, yeah, I know the CEO did that. Let's talk about that. What do we agree about? What do we not agree about? What would we do in that situation? How would we have shown up, and how would we have addressed that differently? That is huge from a relationship standpoint, a connection standpoint of collaborating and co-creating almost what leadership should be within a team. I had a team for 12 years. They didn't leave. They were the exact same team for 12 years. And that modeled leadership. I learned as much about leadership from them as they learned from me.
Yes.
But it was this co-creation that was just beautiful. And it worked. Was it aligning with the other leaders around and of us? Sometimes not. But it was something we could control and we could check in on that we found valuable.
It's interesting you should mention that topic where you might look. I'm going to name it here. Unfortunately, a lot of government agencies, certainly here in Australia, and or not-for-profit organisations, have a great mission, possibly even a great vision, great stated or espoused values, but that's absolutely not how the organisation operates. Right. And so that people are working in that organisation because of an alignment to the greater mission, for example, right? But the toxicity that exists within how the real culture works, which doesn't align with the espoused culture, is real, okay? But they choose to stay. They choose to stay, and as you described, and I'm not saying this was your scenario, but they choose to stay because of their alignment with the bigger mission. And so the trick is for them to stay and, as you described, Russell, lead in a manner with that team that they're protecting them, creating to some degree their own cultural bubble that is aligned to their definition of leadership, and doing the best that they can, controlling what they can control, as you said. But they're doing it with their eyes wide open that a lot of the rest of the culture is actually not healthy. But the mission is worth putting up with that. But that's a conscious decision which protects those people from a mental health point of view. Is that something along the lines of what you've seen and people advocating as well?
Toxic cultures, we've heard a lot about them. I mean, there's a lot talking about this whole mandatory return to work that's really showing what the culture is really like. The pandemic certainly highlighted how amazing and horrible leadership can be. But to the scenario you're describing, I completely understand that, because there's some amazing vision and missions that are so lofty and so phenomenal as the North Star of what you're achieving. that it breaks through any bad leadership or toxicity.
Yes.
Something that I've found that is extremely useful in those scenarios is coming up with your own purpose statement. Now, a purpose statement for a team is, I hate when teams come up with their own vision and mission, because you have a vision and mission. That's what the organization is for. That is larger. However, you can have a purpose that feeds into that vision, that feeds into that mission, that's on a much smaller scale, that you can see your connection to that greater purpose. It cuts through the toxicity of what other teams are doing and what other leaders are doing, but it's something that you can buy into what your work is more valuable by seeing that connection to the larger purpose through something like a purpose statement. The other one was a manifesto. So good. Manifesto is phenomenal. It is, you slap it on you slap it on the wall, you put it up there, you have it. It's almost like a charter that people will actually read. That's what a manifesto is. A charter is usually created, put on a shelf, nobody sees it again and is like, didn't we put a charter together? It's put a manifesto together. It's 5 bullets. It is and create it as a team of, these are the things that we believe in, how we show up, how it represents us, and then check in on it every week almost. Is that still us? Is that who we are? If somebody comes up with something you're not sure about, does it align with our manifesto and our purpose? It's such a beautiful communication tool and a check-in tool that really helps us reinforce the alignment that we know matters to us. So if anything, if you want to really own the culture of the team you work on, I think purpose statements and manifestos, and used, not just slapped up on a wall and forgotten about, but actually operationalized, can have huge benefits.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should say that, because I've just literally come from working with a group of leaders this morning. And one of the activities we do every 3 months when we catch up is each leader writes out a question about leadership from between the last time we caught up and now, that they've had to confront. And then we move the questions around and pair people off, so that pair is, neither of them came up with the question, and they've each got to work out, well, what's the question and what's the answer, and then we share and discuss people's questions and answers. It's quite a powerful little technique to get a lot of shared knowledge around leadership happening, but also to really spark some incredible conversation about how this impacts us. And one of the questions was around allocating work to a new staff member who'd come to a team that was from another staff member who previously did that work, but this new team member is better at it. That's why they got recruited. Right. And that scenario and how this person's happy and that person's not, and all of this sort of stuff. And that led to, relating back to your manifesto, just a statement I said a question I asked them is, in this scenario where we've gone from 5 people to 6 people, is it a new team? And they've gone, is it? And I said, is it? And one person's gone, I think it is. I said, okay, if you got 6 and you lose 1, is it a new team? Is it? The point being that every time a team changes, even by one person out, one person in, and an additional person added, it's actually a new team. And that's absolutely a catalyst for looking at our manifesto and going, who are we, folks? We're a new team now. Let's just reconnect with that. Make sure it's alive and well, because if we don't do that, what happens is, if the team's performance starts to go down after this newbie's in, who do we blame?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you brought this up, because, and I was just having a conversation recently on this, is we talk about teams all the time. There's no such thing as a team. There is a bunch of individuals. There could be absolutely aspects of what that align those individuals, but they all have different motivations, different values, different home lives. And we have to know them as individuals. So if some new person comes on, after, say, you've been with a team for 5-6 years and a new person comes on, the whole dynamic changes. Yes. Somebody feels like an other, whether they want to or not. They don't have that shared history. There was an exercise I did for a team that was really helpful, and they found it really valuable. We did a values exercise. We always do these values exercises. The trick was that we did something a little different. So after we did the values exercise, it was one of those ones where you get 100, break it down to 5, that whole thing.
Yeah.
The thing is when I see values exercises, what I see is people define their values, then they look at them, and then they hide them. And then they're like, thank you, I know my values, and then they leave. We made it a point that once you knew your values, you had to share with everybody what they were, what it actually tangibly meant to you from a personal story. So that we are showing that they live. Values are living, breathing parts of you. They're not just, well, that's where my boundaries start and end. I should mention that. No, you have to communicate them and use them. So we did that piece, and then we did a motivation piece where we looked at 8 different types of motivation and had each member find a primary and a secondary motivation of what brought them to work. Why are they there?
Yeah.
So and then once that was all defined, and we had them discuss it with each other sort of in a world cafe. And once that was done, we looked at where the commonalities were with the values and the motivations, and then did a team value statement based on those motivations and values of what our connective tissue was. And the buy-in for that, because they saw themselves in it. And the minute you add anybody else, do the exercise again. If you did it right the first time, they'll be chomping at the bit to do it again. That's
exactly right. Now, but Russell, I'm too busy to do that. We've got to get the work done, man. We've got to get the work done. I'm too busy. What do you say to folk that always go to that old chestnut?
Absolutely. Then stop calling yourself a leader. I don't want to hear the word leader come from your lips if you say the words, I'm too busy, because you're being led by a calendar. You're not leading anybody. The calendar dictates your life. You are not, if you don't have the time to be strategic, if you don't have the time to breathe, to think about the well-being, the challenges your teams are going through, you are not more important than they are. And if you approach it from that approach, you're not the leader they probably want to serve. And so I hear that, I know the reality of busy. I get it. But I also know the reality of communication, boundary setting, defining if those meetings are needed to be an hour or 5 minutes. Like, you can find the time if you think of this strategically and with intention, and understand at the end, as we said, what does success look like? What is leadership? And if you're not actually living that, then you're not filling the role. You're a widget. You are a commodity that's moving from room to room. That's not leadership. I hate to say it, and I feel horrible because there's so many amazing people in those positions that want and need and could do better, but they don't have the moment. Their boss above them isn't giving them that space. They're being held by their own leadership.
Yeah, that's right. But that's equally leading into enormous wastes of time. The reason why they don't have time is because of the lack of leadership and the lack of clarity, the lack of role clarity, the lack of. So one of the things, when I'm working with teams, and you might do the similar thing, is once we've worked out what people's roles is, I say, well, okay, what are the decisions you can make? What are the decisions you can make? Let's get clear about it. Be clear about the decisions and where decisions sit, because so much time is wasted when you got people who are not the decision maker talking about issues as if they're a decision maker, when they're not going to have the influence. It's not their job, right? They might inform and do all of that sort of stuff with the decision maker, or someone who is the decision maker isn't clear that they're decision maker, and someone else is trying to take the decision and fill the gap because they're not making it. This all leads to wasted time. So the very same people saying, I don't have time, are actually contributing to the lack of time. So you have to have a circuit break and go, hey, we're going to spend some time as a team, laying some stuff out, creating our manifesto, getting clarity. Because with that, we can punch on and deliver whatever success looks like when we've got clarity around that.
Absolutely.
Now, Russell.
Gary.
Yeah, time has been flying by, my friend. How did we get this far in already? And I reckon you and I might have to swing back for episode 2 and 3 and 4 across a bit of a journey here. What's going to be some of the best ways for folks to reach out and find out about the Relationships at Work podcast and what you do?
Absolutely. You can't go wrong with relationshipsatwork.ca. I'm Canadian. It's .ca. So you'll find my podcast there, all the show notes, all the links to all my guests and resources. You can sign up for my newsletter through there as well. I've created a tool that will help you through your onboarding, your thrive, and your exit interviews, because my God, we do a horrible job with that. where they feel holistic rather than one-offs. Relationships@work.ca is the best way to find me, and on LinkedIn as well, for sure.
Now, our Thrive interviews, just give us a little word on them, please, just because you mentioned Thrive and Exit, so people will know Exit. Let's talk just briefly, a little bit of add-on here to the interview about Thrive interviews.
Absolutely. So I noticed over the years that we talk about onboarding so often, and we do onboarding, and we promise so much in onboarding. Here's your experience. Here's all professional development. And then we don't do anything about it. Or then we do performance reviews that have no mention of the promises we made during onboarding about what their employee experience was going to be. So I decided to create a suite of interviews that actually build off the previous one. And you've heard of stay interviews. I'm sure many people have. Who just wants people to stay? I want them to thrive. I don't want butts in seats. I just want, congratulations, you still exist. That's not the kind of culture I hope anybody wants to work within or lead. So I called it a Thrive interview, which should be done throughout the employee journey, building off the onboarding, building off the last Thrive interview to get to the exit interview where we can check in with the employees and go, did we fulfill the promises we made when we hired you? And if not, maybe we can do better next time. But if we don't learn, we don't learn.
That is just brilliant. I love it. We need more Thrive interviews, folks. Let's go and make sure you check the links and go and get those lovely resources that Russell's providing for you. Russell, I want to thank you for your time and joining us here on the Moving Beyond Being Good podcast.
My pleasure, Gary. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Now, folks, if you're not aware already, Yes for Success, How to Achieve Life, Harmony and Fulfillment is out and about. The book was released in November. The ebook was released in October of 2023. And just a couple of weeks ago, the audio book has been finished and last weekend has now become live. We managed to top the charts at number 19 on the Audible charts with some pretty famous people around us. We've got every option that you can imagine to go and access the book, including, of course, if you're really serious about developing a plan to get your clarity about your life and what life harmony means for you, so you understand what your leadership role is for you and what success means for you, go and get this resource and consider getting the online course. All the links are in the show notes. Once again, we want to thank Russel Lolacher for coming along and joining us on the Moving Beyond Being Good podcast, and we'll see you all next time.